Just waiting for Reverend Aaron Long to arrive as we begin our work in considering the majesty of God's sovereign word, reading and thinking alongside of Dr. Francis Turretin. We'll notice that he's talking about natural revelation. Here comes Aaron now.
There we go.
Hey, Aaron.
How was your Easter, Donald?
Very Presbyterian.
So what all y'all do?
Well, we sang hymns about Easter's, Resurrection Day, Easter Day, including the readings. But then he preached on Acts chapter 8, 26 to 40, which was about Philip going down south and meeting the Ethiopian eunuch and preaching the gospel to him, etc. So it was not Easter Sunday as I'm used to, with in the Episcopal tradition, but the pastor and the congregation are superb people. So I've settled in there. We've settled in, and there are people. They're Westminsterians. So how did your Easter go?
Well, I'm still recovering because, see, we did Maundy, Thursday. I always do that down in the fellowship hall where I do a quick communion service, and then we have a covered dish potluck. And then we did Good Friday up here where I go through the 7 last words of Jesus, and I do it as a candlelight service like I do Christmas Eve. Then we had 5 hours worth of Easter egg hunt on Saturday, followed by the sunrise service, followed by breakfast, followed by communion and me preaching on day 17 of the Heidelberg Catechism on Sunday morning.
Oh, I remember those days. Sharon was an organist, and we were in all the Episcopal services, and it's quite a run that you go through with that liturgical tradition. So,
well, it's like I was talking with some of the Anglicans I know, and they ask, we actually do more services than most of them do. And it actually comes from our tradition because we were so tightly tied to the Moravians that the Moravians actually start Palm Sunday. And you know all those readings in the prayer book for all the days of Holy Week?
right.
The Moravians literally do a service every night from Palm Sunday through Saturday. And then in downtown, I've done this a couple of times in Winston, all the downtown churches, the ones that bury at God's Acre in Old Salem, they all have brass bands, and starting at midnight, the brass bands separate out into the 4 cardinal directions, and they play back and forth to each other until they end and walk toward the graveyard until they all meet up in the graveyard for the sunrise service there.
Oh my goodness.
And see, they do love feasts for like 3 of the nights during the week on top of the communion services.
Oh my, that's a bit much, but oh well. Keeping the resurrection is the center of it. And I would add that even as we sit here, Resurrection Sunday was last Sunday, a couple days ago, that in light of the eternal mind of God, I've been reflecting on the eternity of God. There's no succession of thoughts with God. So that 2,000 years ago, when Jesus arose, that is like a half a second ago, as it were, in the mind of God.
Well, time doesn't exist for God.
Time doesn't exist.
And I mean, that's what when I explain predestination, that's the what to the laity, that's the way I talk about it. Is I use an example I learned in my quantum mechanics class, which was a physics class in college. I have to start off with the idea, and I take a tape measure and I uh, put it on one of the tables in the fellowship hall while I'm teaching. And I'll hook the tape measure to something to the end of the table and pull it across. And I said, "How do you know how many inches this table is?" They said, "The tape measure." I said, "Well, how can you determine that? Because the tape measure has a place where it starts and a place where it ends." I said, "The thing is that clock on the wall over there is no different than this tape measure. Time only exists for those things that have a starting point and an ending point. God has no starting point, nor does God have an ending point. Therefore, God does not exist within time. Predestination is just as valid when coupled with human free will, because for God, everything exists in the eternal present. Hence, God refers to himself as the great I am. It appears we are making choices and we have responsibility for the choices that we make. But if we look at things from God's perspective, God knows everything that will be known from the moment we come into existence,
Yep.
because God does not. It's why Christ's crucifixion was efficacious, not only going forward, but also going backward.
Yeah.
It's why the saints of the Old Testament could look toward the cross and still be saved.
Yeah. Yeah. I just was working on that this morning with James Buchanan and the justification of Old Testament saints. And then a little earlier this morning, I was working on Sodom and Gomorrah and all the, Lot and his wife and his two daughters. And as I sat there reflecting on the eternity of God, you know, for us, we do well to remember what we had for breakfast this morning. And yet, to God, Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot, and that whole story is as present to him right now. And the eternity of God is just mind-boggling. The Pope just died. Well, that was known from eternity past, way back before he was ever born. And so when you stand in the light of the eternity of God, it really, as Stephen Charnock notes, is a humbling exercise, because you see the bigness of God and you see how small you are. And the earth is infinitely small to God, and we're even smaller than the earth. And you get a lot of fat heads, proud heads, um, who need the humbling of the doctrine of God.
Donald, I have two questions for you, and the second one that had been brought to my attention, and I want your thoughts on it. The second of which will lead us into Sola Scriptura, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
But the first question I have is what I put up in Twist House and others this morning. What are your thoughts on the idea of common grace? I cannot find the idea of non-believers receiving grace in the Bible, but I hear everybody talking about it. I see God's providence, I see God's love, but grace to me biblically is something that is directed toward the elect. But I hear a lot of these modern Reformed theologians talking about common grace.
I have a few ideas on that, having worked through Homer Huxaba recently, his 3-volume set on Heidelberg Catechism I just finished. I started and finished another retour of his Reformed Dogmatics. I've read it a number of times. And of course, he always is smacking down common grace. And I think I have two answers to that. Number one, if you define, it depends on how you define grace. Grace means beauty and majesty and pleasantness, which is hence when it goes over into soteriology, that
Right.
beauty is seen in the redemptive work of Christ for us, his people, in the more narrow sense. In the Pauline sense, I don't think you can see common grace, but in another sense, the beauty of the Lord is seen in natural revelation, which we're going to go back to with Turretin.
Right.
That even when I get up in the morning and I'm sitting out on the side porch having morning prayer, I hear the birds chirping at one another, and I had a big hawk fly past me a few days ago. And, Jesus teaches not even a sparrow can fall to the ground apart from his will. And the beauty of God's work in providence is spoken with vigor and with loudness. Psalm 119, the heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. I would say, to illustrate that God is screaming everywhere throughout the universe of his glory, his beauty. He's gracious. He sends, as Jesus said, the rain and the sun upon the good and the evil. So, in that sense, he's showing his grace and beauty quite commonly across the globe. But of
But
course,
I ask, I want to push you on one word you used. Would that be God's graciousness, not God's grace?
yeah, I think God's graciousness, his beauty. In that sense, I can hold to common grace, but in the other sense in which we see grace operative, like in the book of Romans, it's soteriological. And it
Because my problem with common grace is the way it gets used. It almost leans into Wesleyan I can't say that word, preeminent, prevent. What Wesley said gave us the ability to choose our salvation. It's a
prevenient
slippery,
grace.
yeah, that's it. Common grace in its modern context seems almost like a slippery slope.
I see what you're saying, but I think in light of the modern ignorance of theology, I don't think they think deeply enough about that. And that's something I'm more and more concerned about is the shallowness that we see about us. It's amazing to watch some of the reactions to the Pope's death and the failure to really appreciate what Rome still is about. And this is from people who claim to be reformed and evangelical.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I just want to slap all of them because take away our historical arguments, okay? Take away our historical differences with Rome. The man they're grieving was an outright heretic, even by their own standards. He brought false idols into the church. He considered women's ordination. I can go through a list of things he did. He tried to change their catechism to say that the church never supported capital punishment, even though it's clearly a biblical. I mean, I don't see why anybody's grieving his death. They should be celebrating that God removed, and I know you're going to get hate from me saying this, but I have prayed the what is it you call them, the vengeful psalms against this man for years, but
Imprecatory psalms.
because he has been a plague on the entire church, and I see God taking him away as being God punishing a wicked sinner. This man was slowly dragging the entirety of the church into hell.
Well, in God's eternal plan, God was present with that man every day of his life, and he never rebuked or repudiated the Council of Trent that still has authority in Rome. But I don't think the average Roman Catholic understands the
Well,
depth.
and I'm going to push you on that. He did not verbally rebuke the Council of Trent. He rejected the Council of Trent in his practice, he rejected it in his theology, and he rejected it in his life. If you read up on Bergoglio, he did not reject it in the way that he should have. He rejected it in embracing liberalism and progressivism.
Yeah.
He rejected, it's funny, he embraced the things that we condemn Roman Catholicism for, and he rejected the things that we could stand by them with.
I got you.
He rejected the inerrancy of the Bible. He rejected the exclusive claims of Christ. He,
Yes, he did do that
I
because
mean, that's what I'm
Hindus,
saying.
Muslims, Buddhists, we all worship the same God, and God is this, that, and the other to all of us. Which actually undermines his own church.
I know that.
If the Buddhist doesn't need Christ, who needs Roman Catholicism?
He did reject Trent. He just rejected the parts of Trent we might actually have agreed with him on. He embraced the things that we reject in Trent, and he rejected the things we would have embraced out of it.
And for the big heads of Romanism, once again, when you stand in the presence of the attributes of God, the earth is tiny and we're even smaller. All the pomp, all the pageantry, all the titles, all the claims to this, that, and the other absolutely melt into total and utter insignificance. And
What you're saying, wearing your mama's drapes ain't going to get you into heaven?
no, no, the drapes and the hats and all the showboating. And anyways,
I
are
was
you
going
want?
to get me one of them hats with them black hats with them pom poms on the top of it.
Oh, brother, such a bunch of showboaters.
All right. My other question that I was going to bring to you to lead us back into the Bible was brought up to me this weekend, and I just want to get your response to it. I was questioned about the book of Jude, and that the book of Jude directly quotes the book of Enoch in it.
Okay.
The original question was, if Enoch is quoted in the Bible, why is Enoch itself as a book not in the Bible? Which, when I started doing a little bit of looking, if you go through a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament, especially in First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, they quote all sorts of books that we don't even have copies of anymore.
Yeah.
What are your ideas on having non-biblical quotes in the Bible and their inerrancy?
Um, I I think that he is pulling something that is true and is the authority is not for Enoch, the authority is with Jude, who quotes truth. I think it's the only place that I know of.
It's the only place that Enoch is quoted in.
Yeah. I do note that in the Chronicles and Kings, they quote the book of Nathan, the book of this, the book of that, which we don't have, but we don't have those records, and we would not say they're inspired. We would say that what was drawn out of them and endorsed by the writer, that he spoke the truth. He was inspired. So Jude is inspired. Chronicles Kings is inspired. That's my sense. I've heard a little bit about that before, but to then drag in Enoch and claim inspiration for Enoch, no, the canon is closed with 39 and 27 New Testament books. uh, and that we have the same Old Testament canon as do the Jews. And I think that's the point of departure, that the Old Testament canon we have is the same as the Jewish church.
Well, and Jerome would have agreed with you on that.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I'm hoping to go through Jerome again.
I like Jerome.
Yeah, he's good. He and Augustine crossed swords a few times, and Jerome accused Augustine of showboating and trying to get a name for himself. And Augustine had to write back to Jerome and say, no, this, that, and the other. And they finally reconciled. And Augustine claimed, with all of his reformed approach, I use the word anachronistically, that all of these varied fathers supported him. Irenaeus, Ignatius, Cyril, Cyprian, Gregory, and others. And Jerome looked around and saw Arianism everywhere, and he looked at Augustine and he said, Augustine is the great restorer, the great restorationist, and applauded Augustine. So I want to kind of track that down a little bit, because I'm running into all these anti-Calvinists on YouTube, and boy, they really hate Reformed theology. Some of these guys, they call it rat poison. One called it the demon god. I mean, they get wild, these YouTube scholars.
Well, it's the problem is none of them. If you will notice, Donald, people don't read anymore. People pick up the Bible two or three times, form their opinions on what they think. They don't learn the Greek and Hebrew. They don't learn Latin. They don't read.
Yeah.
Like, I need you to remind me of Herman Hoskema, because I need to, after we get done, I need to order his 3 volumes on the Heidelberg. That's one that I don't have. But
He's on that point, now I'm not going to say breezy, that's not the word. And I don't want the word preachy. I would say he's sermonic on the Heidelberg Catechism, and he brings up very good points. But he repeats himself time and time and time again. But if I were working in the Heidelberger weekly, I would be consulting with his.
well, that's one that I don't have. But a Brackle does that too. A Brackle repeats himself a lot.
Oh, okay.
I think it may be somewhat of a Dutch thing, and it comes from their regular Sunday night preaching.
Yes. Yes.
But no, the problem you're running into with these YouTube channels is the same problem we run into in the church. People are ill educated. I said this a couple of months ago, and I'm going to use it to feed back into us getting into sola scriptura. I have the utmost respect for Robert Bellarmine, even though I am against what he stood for. I have the utmost respect for Chemnitz, even though I don't always agree with what he says. Because the thing is these men, for good or evil, were erudite, were incredibly well read,
Yep.
and had thought through their positions to a point where today they would just laugh at even scholars in their own traditions throwing this stuff out.
I listened to some professor from Landmark Baptist
Well,
College.
that's your first problem already. You said landmark. You know what that means, right?
Not quite, no.
Okay. But hold on. Let me run you down this. Anytime you hear landmark, there's no point in you even listening to it. The landmark faction of the Baptists are the ones that believe in the succession of blood. They believe that John the Baptist was the founder of the church, and that the church stems through a direct line of people that practice credo baptism. The landmark Baptists will use, and they've got some books out there too. I've got one of them at the house. Next time you're in, if I remember to bring it over, I'll give it to you to read. It's not long, but they claim that the Paulicians and the Marcionites and the Montanists and the Waldensians and the Cathars were all this one apostolic succession leading from John the Baptist through Jesus to the modern independent Baptist movement today. Spurgeon flirted with it for a while because it was around during Spurgeon's time also. But they believe that the entire church as it exists, except for the Baptist, is completely apostate, and that the mark of the true church is baptism by immersion of professing believers.
Okay, I'll dig around a little bit and research, but I was listening to you were commenting on the scholarship of Bellarmine and
Sorry.
Chemnitz and others, and this guy's lecture against Calvinism comments on Calvin only having a training as a Roman priest and then as a lawyer, and he never had any other education, and he writes the Institutes at age 26. Well, and he goes, he was an uneducated man, and he brought his legal logic to the scriptures, and he had no access to other writings and scholarship, and he was out there on his own. And he's telling these people basically that Calvin was uneducated. I mean, just kind of stunned and shocked. And then he talks about how he was raised in a hyper-Calvinistic group as a child, and he grew up telling us that the hyper-Calvinists don't believe in education and Bible colleges and seminaries. And he grew up hearing that. And then finally he emerged and became whatever he was, a non-Calvinist, and how he went to Bible college and how he straightened up on those issues of Reformed theology. And I was like stunned for I don't know what he meant by hyper-Calvinist.
I know I can answer that question for you too.
Okay.
He's talking about the primitive Baptist.
Oh. Okay.
The primitive Baptist will not even practice evangelism. When he is talking about hyper-Calvinism, he odds are grew up, what you're describing, he said, sounds like primitive Baptist. Primitive Baptists reject seminaries and Bible colleges. They reject any concept. Now, there's some of them that break off, but you got to remember they're all Congregationalists. But as a whole, they reject educated clergy. They reject paid clergy. They only have elders and deacons, and you will have a team of elders that'll serve a church, but they only study the Bible. They don't worry about the Greek and the Hebrew. And they are so hyper-Calvinistic that they believe evangelism is a sin. They believe that God will bring those who are the elect into the church, whether they want to or not. And some primitive Baptist churches teach that the elect don't even have to be in the church. You could be a Buddhist, you could be an atheist, you could be a Satanist. If you were one of God's elect, you're just going to heaven.
I've never heard of them. Are they around these days?
Oh yeah, we've got a lot of them around here.
Oh wow.
Abbott's Creek Primitive Baptist Church in Davidson County was founded in the 1790s. There's one about 5 miles down the road from Paul's Chapel. I can go through there. They come out of Rhode Island. They were the first Baptist that came out of Rhode Island into other places. And they all adhere to the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith very strictly. Keach's Catechism very strictly, or at least they used to. Most of them don't even know what those are anymore because they've just rejected anything but the Bible. They are non-instrumental. They do not pay their clergy. They do not believe in educated clergy, and they actually preach against evangelism.
I did not, I knew there were some like that, but I didn't know they were a little wider that, because
There's bound to be some around you. They're dotted. All Baptists in North Carolina come from the primitive Baptist movement. They were the first Baptist down. The only Baptist church in the Southeast that did not start from the primitive Baptist is First Baptist in Charleston, the one that became the mother church for the Southern Baptist.
learn something new every day. See, and when I'm listening to this so-called professor, I'm totally stunned by what he's saying because, Reformed theology is known to advocate for an educated clergy, for catechesis, and for teaching and training and serious academics. So I was like in la la land listening to this guy pontificate and go through tulip in the most shallow fashion imaginable. Now, he argued against his background and how he came out of it once he went to college. So, anyways, I
But
have no.
Donald, you're dealing with the Baptists. The best thing Westminster could have done would have been to suffocate that baby in the cradle, and they didn't do it. But
Say that again.
the best thing the Westminster Assembly could have done was to suffocate that baby in the cradle, but they didn't. The Baptists have no unifying principle. Their congregation, their militant congregationalism has been a plague on the church because it's theology by vote rather than theology by Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why you have 1,500 different types of Baptists.
Yeah. 469, I think, is the number.
Right. Yeah. It's because they don't do biblical theology, they do democratic theology.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
You want to get started with Turretin?
Yeah, let's get it. I got about 20 minutes, so let's get into at least that far into it.
Okay. We left off, I think, on him talking about natural revelation, which I
Yes.
mentioned earlier, screams around the world, declaring God's glory and handiwork, and the elect hear it. And as Paul notes in Romans 1:18 and following, the non-elect dismiss it. They hear it, for God has clearly made it known to them, as that verse states, phaneros. God clearly, emphatically makes known revelation to them, but they don't like that. So they dismiss it and they repress it. And there's an katakontas ton aletheon and adikia. They hold down the truth, holding it down like a spring on a car.
Yeah.
They hold that down with that kind of vigor. They don't want to keep God in their mind. Anyway, you want to get us started here?
We can get started. Although natural theology deals with various matters concerning God and his properties, his will and his works, it does not, without the supernatural revelation of the word, teach us that understanding of God which can serve for salvation. We know God exists without the Bible. We do not know how to reach God without the Bible. It shows that God is and what it shows that God is and what he is like, both in unity of essence and in the nature of some attributes. But it does not show who he is, either in his personal unity, in individua, or with regard to the persons of the Trinity. Natural revelation shows God's will with regard to the law imperfectly and obscurely. Romans 2:14-15. But the mystery of the gospel is entirely lacking in it. It proclaims the works of creation and providence. Psalm 19, Acts 14:17, Romans 1:19-20. But it does not rise to the works of redemption and grace, which can only be known to us by the word. Romans 10:17, 16, 25-26. It's this idea that God has made it to where one cannot deny his existence. One cannot deny his providential nature and care. One cannot deny the law, but one does not know how to reach God from natural revelation.
There is Stephen Charnock's book, The Existence and Attributes of God. If you don't have it, I highly recommend it. And he goes through the details of human anatomy that show the creatorial wisdom and majesty of design. He goes through the ear and how the ear is made, to keep out sand and dust from the brain, how the eye works with the eyelids and, the design of the eye, the design of the mouth, the hands, the feet, the ribs, the heart. And in each of these places, he shows the creational design, the creator, and the daily preserver. And then he goes into nature, the planets and the birds, and then he even says at one point that something that seems so insignificant, the number of hairs on our head, which are ornamental, they don't seem to serve any purpose, but they're ornamental, and some lose their hairs one by one and are unaware when they're losing their hairs. Even that ornamental thing called hair is a part of divine providence, and even Jesus says a sparrow can't fall to the ground without the will of God, and not even a hair from your head can fall from your head apart from God's will. So he really makes natural revelation to be a big, big, big voice in his first two chapters on providence. And I had not quite stopped to think, because I think chapter 1, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, which contrasts natural revelation with supernatural revelation of the Bible, I think in those terms, and I don't stop long enough to think deep enough about the efficacy of God's speech in natural revelation. So Charnock really helps to enlighten that. I would also say maybe what Turretin is missing here is the issue of conscience. I'm not sure, because if you stop and think about conscience as another, Charnock calls it the vicegerent of God, where we know right and wrong, and then he goes through the history of the nations, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, they all have legal standards, which is all traceable back to man being created in the image of God to know right and wrong. And Paul picks that up in Romans 2:14 and 20.
But I think Turretin is hitting on that because he says right there, I can't see because you covered it up now. It shows God's will with regard to the law imperfectly and obscurely. It shows that God has implanted into humanity an understanding of the law. That if we look at nature, we can get an idea of what God's will is, but it is imperfect. We
Yeah.
can understand we should not steal, we should not murder, we should not commit adultery.
And then he goes through those kind of laws that are in the nations generally, that everybody has a legal code of some kind. And then he goes through and said that you cannot one thing you cannot escape is that every man has a religious instinct around the different kinds of religions. But whether you go to Buddha or Quran or Christianity, even in the ancient times, they had a consciousness of the supreme being. They had different names, like in Greek pantheon, all kinds of different gods, but they all knew something about a supreme governor, creator, and preserver. And
And
even
what his will was.
which was they had sacrifices of thanksgiving and sacrifices of propitiation. They knew something was wrong, and this God had to be propitiated. And so he spends a lot of time on natural revelation, for which I'm thankful.
And they had a moral and ethical code,
Yeah,
which goes back to one of my old axes to grind. People will whine that the church has become antinomian, whether it be Reformed, Lutheran, or whatever. Well, of course, the church has become antinomian because theologians no longer talk about the Ten Commandments. You read Calvin, he talks about them. You read Luther, he talks about them. You read Turretin. Turretin has almost an entire volume of the 3-volume series that he deals with the commandments.
he does.
Now, even when you get to Hodge, does Hodge have a section on the commandments?
I'll know when I review him. It's been a long time since reading him.
He doesn't, but he doesn't because he expected people to read Dabney, and Dabney goes into detail on it. But if you're just reading Hodge, they're gone. If you look at any modern systematic theology, they abandon the ethical and moral wisdom of God for deeper theological concepts, making them in and of themselves antinomian text.
Okay, that needs to be researched. That certainly goes along with, in my mind, the loss of the doctrine of justification by faith in the last 100 years.
I mean, I hate to say it because I love the man, but Sproul did not address the Ten Commandments.
Oh,
J.I. Packer didn't.
yeah.
I can go through a list of people that I have respect for in the modern church as theologians that don't. Beakey is the one that actually got me looking into this because Beakey pointed out Ursinus in his commentary deals with the commandments. Calvin deals with the commandments. Turretin deals with the commandments. Cranmer made sure the commandments were in the Holy Communion service. The Westminster Divines dealt with the commandments.
Yeah.
But what have we gotten to?
I'll be thinking about that. Well, we'll press on a little bit here. Whoa. The necessity of Scripture.
Donald, could we pick up on that on Friday? I just got a message. And
Okay,
that seems like a good place to pick up at.
that sounds good. Brother, I'll see you next
Herman
time.
Hoskema, right?
Hoeksema,
Hoeksema.
Hoeksema.
All right. Well, I appreciate you, Donald. I'll see
Okay,
you on Friday.
sounds good. Bye.
All right. Bye.